I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is a deeply ideological figure. I think he's a Jabotinsky revisionist Zionist, and that comes with a lot of limitations and a lot of flaws. When we are willing to redefine our own interests in order to fit in with the interests of the person we desperately want a partnership with who sees us as expendable. That is the definition of an abusive relationship. I have an analysis of Prime Minister Netanyahu that I haven't always held. Once upon a time, I really believed that even if Netanyahu has a strong ideology and cares about the land of Israel and cares about the people of Israel, if he knows he's too weak to stand up to the Americans, he has no business running for office. He should not be our prime minister. That used to be my feeling, my analysis of Netanyahu. That used to be my position when it comes to Netanyahu. But one thing I realized, and I think the moment that I shifted my perception was when Netanyahu spoke at the inauguration of the Bennett-Lapid government. And there's something, I don't even remember what it was, but there's something that Prime Minister Netanyahu said that caused me to believe that he, in his own mind, has been protecting us from the Americans as best he can this whole time. That he knows that the number one antagonist in this chapter of Israel's story is the US. But we can't say it out loud. And I think that he's been working quietly to make us more independent militarily and economically, and to diversify our foreign policy portfolio in order to create the conditions for us to one day be free. I believe he's been doing that. And I think he learned the first time he was prime minister, where he tried to stand strong and resist pressure from President Bill Clinton. And he failed. He got taught a lesson. And after he was taught a lesson and forced to betray his own ideology with the Y agreement, surrendering Hebron, 80% of Hebron, Bill Clinton sent a team led by James Carville to interfere in our political system and run a campaign for Ehud Barak to get Netanyahu out of office. When he came back in 2009, I think he knew, I'm not Yitzhak Shamir. I'm not going to stand up to the Americans like a demagogue. And the way he interacted with the Americans starting in 2009 was to tell them yes and then sabotage their plans. I think he did it with Barack Obama. I think he did it with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump knows it. If you look at Trump's interview with Barak Ravid after he was no longer president, he used very strong language against Netanyahu. It was very clear he was angry at him. He felt betrayed by him. He felt fooled by him. Like he felt like an idiot that he was fooled by this Jew. And also Jared Kushner in his memoirs blames Prime Minister Netanyahu for thwarting the deal of the century. Right? That he torpedoed the Trump administration's plans to impose a two-state solution on us. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is genuinely someone, my perception of him right now, is someone with a deep ideology. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is a deeply ideological figure, not necessarily my ideology. I think he's a Jabotinsky revisionist Zionist, and that comes with a lot of limitations and a lot of flaws. I think he hides, he masks how much of an ideologue he actually is, because he wants to give himself maneuverability, and he wants to create ambiguity around how much of an ideologue he is. Because if he's clearly an ideologue, then the Americans would handle him differently. than if he's maybe a self-serving political animal, which he leaves space for us to think. I believe that Netanyahu knows, even though he might not even admit it to it himself, but I think he feels that the number one threat to Israel, the number one antagonist in this chapter of Jewish history, is the US empire. And he needs to get Israel free of the US empire. And I think he's been working very carefully and very quietly to make us more independent economically, more independent militarily, and to diversify our relationships with different nations around the world. And I don't think there's any other potential prime minister of the state of Israel today who even knows that the Americans are a problem. Naftali Bennett has no clue. No clue. Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, they probably just assume the United States is our ally and whatever they want is probably good for us. And the best thing for us is probably just to be their ally. I mean, see, part of the problem is that most nations first define their interests and then they make alliances, right? They make alliances based on their perception of their own interests. Israel is a nation that first defines who it wants to be friends with, who it wants to be allied to, and then tries to define its interests based on that relationship. So it can maintain that relationship, because from the perception of a lot of Israeli decision makers and from the perception of a lot of the people who are at the top of our military and our intelligence and our economy and our media and academia, the best thing for Israel is to have a close relationship with the US. That's their definition of our interests. Is nothing else. And if that means giving up land, we give up land. And if that means, making deals that are bad for us, we make deals that are bad for us. Because ultimately, the thing that we believe to be best for us is a strong partnership with the United States. Right? And that is slavery. That is the definition of an abusive relationship. When we are willing to redefine our own interests in order to fit in with the interests of the person we desperately want a partnership with, who sees us as expendable. Our most nationalist voices are making a tremendous conceptual error. They can't even fathom the idea that Trump is an enemy. They'd rather believe, and I've seen tweets and posts to this effect, they'd rather believe that the problem is Netanyahu. Not having any appreciation for the fact that it's extremely difficult and extremely complicated for the leader of a small country that is still, unfortunately, very dependent on the US empire in many ways, to navigate resisting policies that are very bad for us, making us more free quietly, right? I'm sure that there are clearly several instances where Prime Minister Netanyahu, even if I'm right about him, that he sees the United States as the number one antagonist in this chapter of Jewish history and sees it as being 100% in our interest to become more independent, more free from the US empire. He still has to choose his battles, and he still has to compromise on things that might hurt him politically and might even go against his ideology. And, a lot of the Kahanistim and neo-Kahanistim, they're very ideologically pure. They always are quick to criticize whenever a national leader does something it's not 100% what they would like him to do. But we should understand, who it was actually Yitzhak Rabin's chief of staff, Eitan Haber. He gave an interview to David Horowitz at the Times of Israel years ago, where he said something very clear and very important. And he's speaking specifically about Netanyahu. He says, when they come and sit in the prime minister's office, they realize something that they didn't realize from the opposition. And Ariel Sharon pretty much said that. He said, what I see from here, I didn't see from there. Right? When he was pressured by George W. Bush to give up Gaza, which is what created a lot of this mess. Haber says that when they come into the prime minister's office, they realize how utterly dependent Israel is on the United States. And they realize they can't behave like the leader of an independent country. Right? You can Google the interview. And I think that Netanyahu, at the very least, knows that this is the case and knows that it shouldn't be the case. And therefore takes whatever steps, and I don't agree with every step, but takes whatever steps he thinks he should be taking to decrease our dependency on the US empire. That's important. And we should support him. We should give him room. That's what I think is happening. That's what I believe to be happening. I believe that's the situation. That Netanyahu knows the Americans are the greatest threat, and that the way to outmaneuver them is very complicated. And it's not, with Biden and maybe with Harris, he's able to resist directly, stand up and look like a big hero standing up to the Americans. With Trump, he can't do that. Trump is a strong leader. Trump is unpredictable. Trump might be a little bit crazy, right? He might be a little mentally ill, right? And there's no telling what he's going to do if you say no to him, if you embarrass him, if you humiliate him, right? Israel's going to stand up to Donald Trump. And he's coming in not only with an axe to grind against Netanyahu for everything that happened last time, but also with a feeling that Israel owes him. In Trump's own mind, he gave us Jerusalem. He gave us the Golan Heights. This is the way he speaks. From Trump's perspective, moving the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is giving Israel Jerusalem. And how dare we be so ungrateful as to say no when he wants us to do a two-state deal? How dare we? That's Trump's perception. I'm very concerned about the next 4 years. But what's good is that Trump already showed his hand. He already bullied Netanyahu into something that at least the Israeli national camp knows is bad for us. And if we're willing to look at the reality, if we're willing to accept what the people in this country who support the deal take for granted, by the way, every Israeli who supports this ceasefire hostage deal says explicitly, Trump forced Netanyahu. There's no question. Trump himself says it explicitly. It's obvious to anybody who can see. It's only the people in the national camp, it's only the Jews who are so emotionally and psychologically invested in Trump, in the idea that we can have a friend, an ally, a sympathetic ear in the White House that will let us do all the things we want to do. It's only those Jews who have trouble accepting the fact that Trump forced this on Netanyahu. Right? They want to believe it's Netanyahu because he has some personal interest in this deal that he didn't have in July. That this is something he wants to do. I don't buy that. I don't even think that Netanyahu has been so beholden to his, nationalist coalition partners. I think Netanyahu wants to stay in Gaza. I don't think it's because of Smotrich or Ben Gvir. I think he might use them as an excuse. I think Netanyahu knows Israel needs to stay in Gaza. I think Netanyahu knows that the disengagement of 2005 was an injustice that should be corrected at the right time in the right way. I think the plan is probably, or was probably, because Netanyahu refused to talk about it day after plan. I think his thinking was likely that we're going to keep our military there as long as we can, because there's no other option, right? There's no one else who can be in control there. And eventually there will be Jewish groups who will try to come in and build a yeshuv, and the army will kick them out, and they'll do it again, and the army will kick them out, and they'll do it again, and the army will kick them out. And after 16 times, maybe we'll let them stay, and there'll be a new Jewish community in Gaza, and maybe we'll rebuild Gush Katif, and it'll probably happen something like that at the right moment, in the right geopolitical circumstance, where we can get away with it, and there's a lot of other things going on in the world, and whatever, or maybe there was like a terror attack the day before, and we happen to have this much sympathy capital that will allow us to do something like that. I think that was really Netanyahu's plan. and I think that Trump is saying no way.